He said he wanted peace on his land, so he buried it, one body at a time. That was how the people of Richmond remembered Colonel Matthew Pryor, not as a hero, not as a farmer, but as the man who preached peace, and found it only through pain. Virginia, 1798. The air was thick with the sweetness of early summer tobacco, and the hills of Hanover County rolled like waves under the morning fog. Rose Hill Plantation stood at the crest of it all, white columns, red brick chimneys, a symmetrical garden that stretched toward the horizon. From a distance it looked serene, even divine. But those who lived beneath its shadow knew it was built on silence. Colonel Matthew Pryor was a decorated veteran of the Revolutionary War, a man who had ridden with Washington's army, carried the scars of battle, and returned home with the conviction that discipline was the highest virtue. He was the kind of man who demanded the world march in perfect order, the sun rising when it should, the fields worked in rhythm, the people beneath him moving like clockwork gears. He kept his hair tied back, his boots polished to a soldier's shine, and his words clipped and sharp like musket fire. In the drawing rooms of Richmond he was admired for his sermons on morality, long speeches about obedience, restraint, and peace through control. The local church even printed his lectures, calling him a man of divine order. But behind the walls of Rose Hill, order had a different meaning. Every morning before the first bell, Pryor would stand on his veranda overlooking the quarters. He watched the enslaved workers step into line under the overseer's whip, the sound of chains faint under the wind. He said it gave him comfort, the rhythm of discipline, the sight of a world obeying its rightful pattern. He carried a small leather book at his side, a ledger he had kept since his army days. Inside were names. Every worker on the plantation, listed in neat handwriting beside marks and notations. Isaac, insolence. Ruth, delay. Samuel, theft. To anyone else it looked like bookkeeping. But for Pryor it was scripture. Each name, each mark, a sin recorded, and a punishment delivered. He believed that punishment was divine. He said pain was the only language the wicked understood. And to prove his theory he built a place to contain it. The story of the pit began as rumor, something the field hands whispered about after dark, when even the dogs were asleep. Behind the smokehouse, where the ground dipped near the edge of the woods, Pryor ordered a hole to be dug, 12 feet deep, 6 wide, walled in with packed clay. When it was finished, he stood over it and declared, "This shall be my place of peace." He called it the cooling pit. He told his neighbors it was a place for reflection, where wrongdoers could be left to calm their tempers and pray for forgiveness. But those who went down rarely came back the same. The first was a man named Elias. Accused of stealing bread, he was chained by the wrists and lowered by rope. When the cover was shut, the pit became absolute darkness. No light, no sound except for the drip of groundwater against stone. Elias stayed 3 days. When the hatch was opened he didn't speak. He couldn't. His eyes blinked at the sun like a man seeing it for the first time, his skin pale, his voice gone. He was sent back to work in silence. The others learned. No one argued. No one sang. No one dared to speak when Colonel Pryor's shadow passed by. He had found his peace. And peace at Rose Hill meant fear. By autumn the pit was no longer punishment, it was ritual. When someone disobeyed, Pryor would take up his ledger, trace his finger down the page and say softly, "Let them reflect." Days later the lid would open. Sometimes the man came back alive. Sometimes he didn't. When bodies were found, Pryor buried them quietly beyond the fence line and marked the graves with small stones, each carved with a number, never a name. He called it order. The workers called it the Devil's Prayer. From the outside, Rose Hill remained perfect. Travelers admired its symmetry. Preachers dined with Pryor and called him a righteous man. And every Sunday he stood at his parlor window reading scripture aloud. Blessed are the peacemakers. He believed those words. But for the souls trapped beneath his peace, the only blessing was forgetting. And so, under the calm Virginia sky, the legend of Rose Hill began, a story whispered in the fields, carried by wind through the tobacco rows. That somewhere on Pryor's land, beneath the soil and the sermons, there was a hole that swallowed the living. And that every time he prayed for peace, the ground trembled. By the turn of the century, Rose Hill had become more than a plantation. It was a machine, a living organism built on fear and precision. Colonel Matthew Pryor sat at its heart, keeping time like a clockmaker, every movement measured, every sound accounted for. He believed silence was the highest form of obedience. And on his land, silence ruled. Each dawn before the sky broke, the bell rang. Hundreds of men and women filed into the fields, Heads down, lips pressed, the rhythmic shuffle of feet against damp earth. The overseers no longer needed to shout. The whip rarely cracked. Fear had made words unnecessary. Pryor watched from his veranda, his hand resting on the rail, eyes unblinking. He said it filled him with calm. He called it the order of silence. To the outside world it looked like discipline. To those beneath him it was despair. The pit had grown infamous. In the dark corners of cabins, people whispered of what it took. The sound of chains sliding over wood, the smell of damp soil, the faint gasps that echoed up from the earth at night. Those who returned spoke little. Some wandered the quarters as if half dreaming, their eyes hollow, their skin pale and cold. Others never returned at all. But Pryor kept his ledger. Each time someone was lowered into the pit, he wrote their name with meticulous precision, a thin smile crossing his face as if marking a victory. And at the end of every week he would sit in his study, candlelight flickering over ink-stained pages, and read their names aloud. For reflection, he would murmur. For peace. No one dared to question it. Not the overseers. Not the servants. Not even the preacher from town who visited twice a month, accepting Pryor's hospitality and avoiding the subject of the pit entirely. Because everyone knew, Matthew Pryor was a man of influence, a hero of the revolution, a friend of judges and clergy. And in a world that prized order over mercy, no one dared to expose the truth that his peace was built on terror. But one man did not forget. His name was Josiah Carter, 30 years old, strong, quiet, with a face carved from endurance. He had been born on Rose Hill. He had watched his wife, Lila, lowered into the pit for disobedience. Her crime, refusing to kneel when Pryor demanded a prayer before supper. She had been left there for 3 days. When they brought her out, fever had already taken her. Pryor said she was purified. She was buried behind the smokehouse at dawn. That night, Josiah sat by the dying embers of his fire and whispered her name into his hands. Lila, as if speaking it aloud could pull her back. And from that night on he began to remember every name that disappeared. He could not read or write, but he found his own way to keep record. Each time someone was taken, he carved a small mark into the bark of a tree behind the quarters. A line for each soul. When the bark filled, he began on another tree. He called them his living ledgers. And in time, the grove behind the cabins became a forest of memory. By 1801, the pit had claimed more than 20. But Pryor's obsession was only deepening. He began to treat the pit not as punishment, but as ritual cleansing. He claimed the land itself demanded purity. He said he could feel unrest in the soil, that the very air grew heavy when workers disobeyed. Neighbors thought it was madness. But they didn't say it aloud. They saw the perfect rows of tobacco, the wealth flowing through Pryor's hands, and they called it divine favor. They never saw the rows of graves hidden in the trees. One night in midsummer, a storm swept across Hanover County. Lightning tore through the sky, thunder rolling like cannon fire. The wind roared through the fields, tearing leaves from the stalks. In the chaos, the pit began to flood. Water poured in through the cracks in the clay walls. Inside, 3 men and 1 woman were chained, their voices rising through the downpour, screams muffled by thunder. When the morning came, the pit was half filled with muddy water. The ropes hung slack. The bodies inside had drowned. Pryor's reaction was not grief, it was fury. He called it sabotage. He accused the overseers of neglect, the enslaved of rebellion. And as the rain fell, he ordered the bodies burned. He said it would purify the ground. That night, something in Rose Hill changed. The workers moved slower. The air itself felt heavy wrong. The songs that once rose at dusk, quiet hymns hummed in secret, fell silent. Even the animals grew restless. Dogs barked at nothing. Horses kicked their stalls. And in his grand mansion, Colonel Matthew Pryor sat before his ledger, tracing his finger over the names of the dead. He did not see people, only balance. Each life, to him, a mark of discipline in the ledger of order. But for Josiah, those same names burned behind his eyes. He went to the grove that night, the one with the carved trees, and he pressed his hand against the bark until his knuckles bled. He whispered, "They won't vanish. Not while I'm breathing." And from that moment, the ground beneath Rose Hill began to shift, not in soil but in spirit. The silence that Pryor worshipped was no longer obedience. It was waiting. Slow fade of thunder. The camera pans to the flooded pit, the water still bubbling softly. The voice lowers, deliberate and chilling. The colonel had built his peace on the graves of his own. But peace built on fear is never still. It breathes. It festers. And when it wakes, It devours its maker. From that night forward, something changed at Rose Hill. The air grew heavy and the soil, once rich and dark, turned pale and hard. The tobacco withered. The song stopped. Even Pryor began to hear things at night, soft sounds beneath his floorboards, like the rhythm of slow breathing. He sat at his desk, tracing the names in his ledger, whispering them again and again until the ink smudged under his trembling hand. The names no longer brought him peace. They brought him silence, deep, suffocating silence that pressed against his chest until he could barely breathe. Out in the grove, Josiah stood among the carved trees, the wind moving through the leaves like whispered prayers. He placed his hand against the bark until his palm bled and murmured the same words each night. They won't vanish. Not while I'm breathing. The pit still stood at the edge of the field, flooded but still, its water thick and dark as tar. Some said it moved on its own, that when the wind blew, it rippled like something alive beneath the earth. The silence that once meant obedience was no longer fear. It was waiting. And deep below the ground, the peace Matthew Pryor had built began to stir. Years passed and Rose Hill fell silent. The fields, once thick with crops, turned to weeds. The house sagged under the weight of time, shutters torn loose by storms, windows blackened by dust. The pit still yawned at the edge of the property, water stagnant, ringed by reeds that never grew higher than a man's knee. The locals avoided the road that led to it. They said the air there was wrong, too still, too heavy, like the earth itself was holding its breath. After the storm and the deaths, Colonel Matthew Pryor had changed. He stopped attending church. His sermons on discipline and moral order ceased. He no longer rode out to inspect the fields or summon the overseers. Instead, he spent his days inside his study, staring at the ledger that had once been his pride. The ink had faded, the pages warped by moisture, but every name was still there. Every mark he had made. He read them aloud now, but the words didn't sound like scripture anymore. They sounded like confessions. Sometimes, late at night, the servants heard him pacing the halls, muttering apologies to no one. Other nights, he sat motionless by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, the ledger open in his lap. One evening he was found standing in the yard, barefoot, staring toward the pit as rain began to fall. When the butler tried to guide him back inside, Pryor whispered, "They're waiting for me." By 1803 the plantation was dying. The fields refused to yield. The livestock grew sick and listless. Tools rusted overnight. Workers left one by one, some fleeing in the dead of night, others simply vanishing. Pryor stopped paying the overseers altogether. The house emptied until only a few loyal servants remained, each afraid to leave, more afraid to stay. Josiah was still there. He worked in silence, tending to what little remained of the grounds. But he no longer bowed his head when Pryor passed. He no longer looked away. He had become something more than a man, a shadow of endurance carved from sorrow and rage. Some said Pryor feared him, that he saw in Josiah's eyes the reflection of his own damnation. Then came the infection. It started as a sore on Pryor's hand, a small cut he ignored. Within days his arms swelled, the veins darkened, the pain unbearable. The doctor from Richmond refused to return after his first visit, muttering that the colonel's wound reeked of something unnatural. Pryor took to his bed, delirious, clutching the ledger against his chest. The servants said he called out names between fits of fever, begging forgiveness, pleading to be left alone. One night, thunder rolled over the hills and the lamps in the house flickered out. The servants heard footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, crossing the wooden floors. Then came the sound of the front door opening and the rain rushing in. By morning the house was still. They found him at the pit. Kneeling in the mud, head bowed, ledger beside him. His eyes were open but his body was cold. Around him, the ground bubbled faintly as if something beneath was stirring. The pages of his ledger were soaked through, the ink washed away until all that remained were the faintest outlines of names, ghosts of words long spoken. When they buried him, the preacher refused to read from scripture. The few who attended said the ground shook as the coffin lowered, though no wind blew. Within weeks, the pit began to sink, collapsing inward until it was nothing but a hollow scar in the earth. Decades later, the land was sold. The new owners tried to plant corn, but the seeds would never sprout. Rainwater pooled in the same spot every spring, and at night, travelers passing by swore they saw faint lantern lights moving through the fields. And when thunder rolled over the Virginia hills, the air would carry the faintest sound, not of weeping, not of cries, but of breath, slow and steady, rising from beneath the earth. They say that's the sound of the pit still breathing. History buries its crimes in shallow graves. But the ground never forgets. If you stayed until this moment, thank you for walking with me through the pit at Rose Hill. What you've just heard isn't just a story about cruelty. It's a warning written in history's blood. Colonel Matthew Pryor believed he was creating peace through discipline, but all he built was a pit, one that swallowed his humanity and left his legacy to rot in silence. Stories like this are not just tales of the past. They're mirrors, reflecting what power, pride, and fear can turn men into when compassion dies. Beneath the mansions, beneath the sermons, beneath the polished portraits of honor, there were shadows. And in those shadows, people suffered, vanished, and were buried, their cries drowned out by time. But here on Hidden Tales, we don't let those cries disappear. We dig them up. We give them voice. We remind the world that every buried truth leaves a scar, and every scar has a story to tell. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Hidden Tales, like this video, and share it with someone who believes history should be remembered, not rewritten. Every view, every comment, every share helps keep these hidden stories alive, the ones that history tried to erase. Because when we uncover the forgotten, we honor the truth. When we listen to the echoes of the past, we learn how to stop them from repeating. So stay with me. There are more stories buried in the dark, stories of power, of pain, of survival, waiting to be unearthed. This is Hidden Tales, where the past doesn't stay buried.